Welcome back to News in Focus. Now, today, the inquest into the deaths of anti-apartheid activists Chief Luthuli and Mxenge had began. Now, this is a collaborative attempt to have the initial findings of the activist death overturned. Now, the KwaZulu-Natal MPA, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and the National Archives placed the two concurrent inquests in the Pietermaritzburg High Court today. Joining me now to discuss this, I'd like to welcome legal analyst Rasheed Smith. Rasheed, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakallah so much for joining us here. It's been a long time, so we're really glad to have you here.
Walaikum salam. It's a pleasure as always to be here. It's always a good time when we spend time
together.
No,
definitely, Rasheed. Rasheed, these apartheid killings, I think we scratch our heads all the time because it's like we are sitting waiting for answers decades after this had happened. Of course, these deaths happened 1967, the one of Chief Luthuli and Griffiths Mxenge in 1981. Is it just a matter of underfunding, or is it a fact that there really needs to be in-depth investigations into these killings and then, of course, can be brought ahead by the MPA and ultimately into the courts?
Look, I'm happy in the way that you've asked the question, whether it's a funding-related matter or if it's an investigative issue. And the way that it's been brought forward currently, it shows that there may have been investigative mishaps at the time when the initial inquests were made. For instance, when we think about Chief Luthuli's death, it was because of a goods carrier. And SA Railway at the time, no one within SA Railway or SA Railway as an entity were found to have been culpable of any wrongdoing. However, now it is being alleged that there's been new evidence that has come to light, which shows that certain levels of investigation have now either brought forward new evidence that might overturn the inquest, or the way that the inquest was done in inception may not have been done to the standard that we now would hold our NPA to. And the same would go as well for the killing of Mr. Mxenge, where the stabbing, it was known that this was a murder. Not only was he stabbed 45 times, but his throat was slit. And then there was a confession that was drafted that had led to a potential finding of criminality. But again, amnesty was then granted to the perpetrators. And in my opinion, it seems as though the TRC at the time was used to escape culpability. And that has been a bit of a mishap that people have found with the TRC, where they say that it may have been used to certain people's advantage to escape culpability. And now we hope that if that were the case, that certain other judgments as well can also be overturned, and we can find justice not just in this instance, but for various other people that went through the TRC process.
No, without a doubt. And I mean, the cases that come to mind, Imam Haroon, the Craddock 4, there's so many others that come to mind. And this is where I think the crux of the matter is, when you look at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, this should have been solved within 1997. But of course, we still never got to the bottom of all of this. In the year 2025, I mean, how does the NPA, along with the Hawks and other prosecuting authorities, now really mull over this case, given that there's such a huge time period in between what had happened to where we are now?
In my opinion, exactly like you're saying, because there's such a long period of time, the perpetrators may not face justice. But I think the point of something like this is, again, for the confidence in the citizenry at large, for us to have the emotional wounds taken care of, and for us to heal as a nation emotionally. So finding justice there may be that as a whole, there might be other, like I said, cases that can be brought to light, and other convictions that may now be either overturned or brought forward, and justice for the nation. I think it's more important that as a nation we face justice, and not just for the specific perpetrators involved in these crimes.
Yeah. One of them that I think really stands out is, of course, seeing Janusz Walusz, of course, being granted parole. Of course, he's no more in the country at this very moment. When you listen to the South African Communist Party, and of course the wife, Dimbo Hani, the wife of the later Chris Hani, a lot of it comes down to government not really dealing with these apartheid killings. Now, this is another opportunity for government to go ahead and actually show that they are going to take this quite seriously, the killings of especially somebody of the stature of Chief Luthuli, who was the president of the African National Congress. Prosecutions is going to be difficult, isn't it, Rasheed? Because what we are seeing here is either these perpetrators are not alive, or they're probably sitting in the 80s or 90s. People would ask, what's the point? But then you go to, of course, Nazi perpetrators who, of course, committed hideous crimes during the Holocaust. There we see actual prosecutions happening. Is there a leaf that the prosecuting authorities in this country can take take a page from that book? Or are we really at this moment saying, well, there isn't much that can be done given their age and given the fact that some of these perpetrators are really not alive at this moment?
You know, in my opinion, I think justice has no expiry date. If someone is still alive, regardless of their age, they should face justice. And like you rightfully pointed out, this has been displayed all over the world, especially in Germany, where people late into their geriatric years are still prosecuted. And it has, in fact, happened in South Africa as well, where an apartheid criminal was brought to justice after the age of 70 years old. And I do think that this is more for the democratic project than it is just for justice in the strict sense. If we're seeing now what is happening with our country, there's a lot of division. There are nationalist agendas being pushed. We are a very fractured society. So these are the types of exercises like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was meant to do in the first place, is more of a democratic exercise than a judicial exercise. So I think these things being brought forward and being taken more seriously is going to bring some more confidence, not just within the judicial process, but within the South African democratic project as a whole.
Rasheed, another interesting part of this is the closure perspective. So the family of Chief Albert Luthuli has said that, look, finding closure would be something that we would be, first and foremost looking for. Of course, they would say, look, justice is something that we want, but if the justice cannot be served, closure, the fact that this was a murder of Chief Albert Luthuli, this was, of course, Griffiths and Mxenge, it's found that he was murdered, but the fact to find closure of who did it. We saw that with the Ahmed Timol case about 8 years ago, where the perpetrator was, of course, discovered. The currently Imam Haroon's one is still under much investigation. But the fact that they can find this closure and allow there to be the truth to come out that this was an apartheid killing and this was not done on a basis of suicide, as was reported by the then apartheid police at the time, who had said, listen, this was done of suicide and our police officers have no hand in this.
Correct.
Yeah.
And I think as we uncover how these crimes actually took place, what we also start to see is how the government of the time actually went about in the furtherance of apartheid as a crime. We'll never know what the country may have turned out if, for instance, Chris Hani remained alive, if Chief Albert Luthuli remained alive. But knowing the motive and certain of the mechanisms that were used against him in the furtherance of their deaths, we can also see what the intent behind the apartheid regime was, what they were trying to suppress, how they were trying to oppress us by murdering our leaders. And like you've pointed out with the Timol case as well, there's a lot more in the surrounding circumstances that lead to the fabric and the tapestry of what South Africa looked like at the time and what it could have been had it not taken place. So that also uncovers to us how the apartheid regime viewed our leaders and how it viewed the potential of our freedom. Because, of course, at the time when these people were murdered, they weren't murdered in anticipation of apartheid finishing. They were murdered for the furtherance of apartheid indefinitely. So we can then also uncover and unpack what was the machinery that was actually used, who were the perpetrators, who involved, what were the motives of the highest of officials. And that can allow us to see what of those remnants still remain within our society today. Because once we unpack the mechanisms that were used back then, we can start to unpack what of those mechanisms are still active right now, even though they are not used in violence or used in the death of our leaders. We can still then also unpack to say, how are those things affecting us currently and how we can start to dissolve and unravel them.
Talk of mechanisms, Rasheed, I want to touch on potential sentencing, potential prosecution. If we have a case of there being those who had committed these crimes during apartheid, police officers, any security officer of the time, they are alive right now, even if they are at the age of 80 or 90. Where does the South African courts then draw the ability to say, we're going to sentence you, even if it's for 5 years? The point that I'm trying to get to, Rasheed, is sending a message to the public that whoever committed crimes during apartheid can still be prosecuted in a democratic South Africa.
Definitely. I feel as though for some, depending on how the evidence unravels, it might not just be the crime of murder. There could be a myriad of crimes that are attached to it. And some of those may have minimum sentencing. So regardless of the person's age, minimum sentences would particularly apply. But also, like you're pointing out, there is a direct message that needs to be sent within the democratic dispensation. And for that reason, I feel as though the courts would not look at the person's age, in a determining factor. Now, there's a difference in Chief Albert Luthuli's case and the case of Mr. Mxenge, because one had gone through the TRC, the other one did not. So the one where TRC came forward, there might be the mitigating circumstances that they did confess to it, if it is found that they didn't use the process to their advantage. On the other end, it would be a strict murder. Whether those murders will be applied posthumously because some of the perpetrators may be dead already. Again, I think that it's more important for the democratic project than it is in those particular instances just to punish the perpetrators themselves.
Rasheed, one final question. This is a big test for the NPA, isn't it? I think huge controversy with regards to them, the question of funding, the question of not really delivering prosecutions, whether it's cases like the Omotoso case where there's been victims of what had happened through televangelist Omotoso and some of his fellow suspects. The victims have come forward and said, well, where is the prosecuting authority in really pressing these charges or doing something to send a message? You then, of course, get the current state capture report where everything seems to be climbing very, very slowly. So the NPA, this is a huge test for them, isn't it? Just to try and deliver something where the public can look back and say, okay, we've got some sort of confidence within our prosecuting authority of this country.
Look, I think you've nailed it. You've hit the nail on the head. They have to start building a lot more confidence that the public has, not just in the NPA, but the judiciary as a whole.
Yes.
A lot of people, especially in the Nolani case that had recently been decided, that was also a state capture related case. But the NPA failed to establish prima facie evidence against the perpetrators. So again, doing these things are a lot more important for the structure of our democracy than they are just in the particular instances. And like you rightfully pointed out, it is a confidence-building exercise. And sometimes when the NPA is faced with what they are currently faced with state capture happening on the one side, with the apartheid legacy also coming back to haunt us, they have to be shown as an element within a democracy that we can trust in order to sort these things out on our behalf.
Rasheed, always a pleasure having you, and thank you so much for joining us. Ameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you for having me.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. As legal analyst Rasheed Smith, just breaking down, of course, the start of the inquest today into the murders of former ANC President Chief Albert Luthuli and Griffiths Mxenge. After the break, are we going to try and get reaction to Mcebisi Jonas? He's been appointed the special envoy to the US from South Africa. This comes weeks after Ibrahim Rasool, the ambassador of South Africa to the United States, was sent packing. Do stay tuned after this break.